It's this part, Sam's speech in the Two Towers, when he talks about how what they're going through right now is like the great stories. And he explains to Frodo that there's some good in this world and that it's worth fighting for. During this time within the films, they're at Osgiliath, and they've been taken captured by Faramir, Boromir's brother, who at that time within the film is deliberating on whether or not he's going to take Frodo and the ring back to his father, the Steward of Gondor, that being Denethor II. However, in the book, none of this actually occurs. Sam does give somewhat of a speech within the books, however, they're never taken to Osgiliath by Faramir, because Faramir within the books is kind of a completely different character, at least from my view. I've discussed this in some of my other videos that I dedicated to Faramir, who is honestly my favorite character within the books. But within the books, whenever Faramir encounters Frodo and Sam and is made aware of them having possession of the One Ring, Faramir understands their mission, understands the dangers of taking that ring anywhere near Minas Tirith, and he supports Frodo and Sam in their objectives and sends them on their way. And when speaking of the ring within the books, Faramir actually states, "I would not take this thing if it lay by the highway." He goes on to say that he wouldn't take the ring even if Minas Tirith were falling and he alone could save her. So in the book, Sam and Frodo never make it to Osgiliath, how it's shown within the films. However, in the books, Sam does refer to the stories of old and how it relates to the situation that they're currently going through. But he does this in Cirith Ungol. And Cirith Ungol is Sindarin or Sindarin, an Elvish language, in fact the Elvish language that's more predominantly used amongst those in Middle-earth. The most predominantly used Elvish languages within Tolkien's works are Quenya and Sindarin or Sindarin. However, there are more than that, but those are the two most prominent. And Cirith Ungol is a word that is Sindarin or Sindarin, and Cirith means cleft or pass, at least from my understanding, and Ungol means spider, and is actually rooted in the same word of Ungoliant. And Ungoliant is that monstrous being rooted in darkness that transforms herself into a spider-like creature, and ultimately is the mother of Shelob, that spider who has made that place, Cirith Ungol, her home. And it's at this place, whenever they are adventuring there, prior to them meeting Shelob, that Sam gives somewhat of the same speech that we find within the film, The Two Towers, there when they're at Osgiliath. And so in thinking about some of the differences between Sam's speech in the books and what's found in the movie, in the book, Sam initially proposes the question, he wonders what kind of tale that they've landed themselves into. And he recalls the old tales and adventures that he remembers hearing growing up. And he discusses how he used to think that the great adventures of old, that the people that participated in them went out of boredom to find adventure. However, he talks about he no longer feels that way, and that the stories that really mattered, the people that took part in those accounts and in those adventures, oftentimes found themselves thrust into those situations. His words were actually that they just landed in them. But he does talk about how those individuals within those stories must have had plenty of chances of turning back. However, they didn't. They kept pushing and moving forward. And he talks about how if they had not kept pushing and moving forward, we would have never known who they were, and we would have never known their adventure and their story. It's because that they kept moving on and pushing forward that we get to know their tales and their stories. And he also discusses how even though they kept pushing and made it through to the point where we would one day hear about their experiences and what they went through, oftentimes their ending wasn't the happiest one or the one that you would expect. And he even cites how Frodo's uncle Bilbo, whenever he left on his adventure and he came back, things were never quite the same for him because of how he had been changed during his adventure and during the experiences that he went through. And Frodo chimes in and explains to Sam that's the way of real tales, is that the people experiencing them never know what kind of ending that they'll have, whether it be a happy ending or a sad tale. And to this Sam replies, "No, sir, of course not. Beren now, he never thought he was going to get that Silmaril from the Iron Crown and Thangorodrim, and yet he did. And that was a worse place and a blacker danger than ours. But that's a long tale, of course, and goes on past the happiness and into grief and beyond it. And the Silmaril went on and came to Eärendil. And why, sir, I never thought of that before. You've got some of that light of it in that star glass that the lady gave you. Why, to think of it, we're in the same tale still. It's going on. Don't the great tales never end?" As Sam and Frodo are having this conversation, it elicits something within Frodo which I think is pretty interesting. It goes on to describe how Frodo said, "It's saying a lot too much," said Frodo, and he laughed, a long, clear laugh from his heart, such a sound that had not been heard in those places since Sauron came to Middle-earth. For me, what happens right there is pretty interesting and important. They're in pretty dire straits and in a difficult circumstance. They've been separated from the rest of the Fellowship and had to journey alone with Gollum. And at this point in time, both Sam and Frodo had been through so much, especially when considering everything that they went through in the books, which compounds and adds so much more than we watch in the movies, though I love the movies. And yet Sam's speech within the books helps Frodo to feel some sense of joy and to be merry again. And he had laughed in such a way that that area had not heard such a laugh since Sauron had come to Middle-earth. At least that's the way it's described in the books. For me personally, that speech within the book, like in the movie, is such a powerful interaction. The dynamic and situation is different, and also the response that Sam's speech elicits from Frodo is different within the book and in the movie. However, both provide Frodo, at least from my perspective, a resilience in order to keep pushing through within his own tale and within his own story. And similar to the movie, they have an interaction where Frodo tells Sam, "But you left out one of the chief characters, Samwise, the stout-hearted. I want to hear more about Sam, and Frodo wouldn't have got far without Sam, would he?" "Now, Mr. Frodo," said Sam, "you shouldn't make fun. I was serious." "So was I," said Frodo, "and so I am." And then in comparing that interaction that Frodo and Sam had there in Cirith Ungol, where Sam is providing elements of that same speech that he provided there in Osgiliath within the films The Two Towers. Within the film version, Sam says, "It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were, and sometimes you didn't want to know the end. Because how could the end be happy? How could the world go back to the way that it was, when so much bad had happened? But in the end, it's a passing thing. This shadow, even darkness, must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out all the clearer." Those were the stories that stayed with you, that meant something, even if you were too small to understand why. But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back. Only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something. And this is one of my favorite changes to that speech that was added within the films. Frodo says, "What are we holding on to, Sam?" And Sam replies and states that there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. In my own life, several times have I gone back to this speech and watched specifically just that part of the film in order to feel comfort, peace, and inspiration and motivation to continue going during times that I felt were difficult, dark, or discouraging. Sometimes those periods of darkness or difficulty that I was experiencing were things that I were going through internally, or they were things that I was experiencing externally that were really difficult to go through. And sometimes it was just what I was observing within all the chaos that sometimes presents itself within the world that can bring about discouragement. And sometimes those things that I was going through, whether they be internally, externally, or the situations and circumstances in the world, sometimes there was this feeling of how could the end ever be happy? And how could the world ever go back to the way that it was when so much bad had happened? But I truly believe that in the end, it's just a passing thing. This shadow, even darkness, must pass. A new day will come, and when the sun shines, it will shine out all the clearer. And I truly believe that, and that's one of the reasons why in my own life I've gone back to that part so many times. I've rewatched it over and over again on some days. And in continuing to think about how I might be able to apply what I've learned from reading that account within The Two Towers or watching that account within The Two Towers film, when thinking about Sam's speech within the books, he leans into it that we shouldn't even be here, which is honestly similar to some of the things that he states within the film prior to him going into his speech. And that's one of those similarities. Sometimes we might be in a situation that is difficult and we feel like we shouldn't even be here. However, paraphrasing another wonderful quote found within Lord of the Rings, that's not for us to decide. What we have to decide is what to do with the time that has been given to us. Also within the speech within the book, he talks about those that he learned about from those great adventures and those great stories often found themselves where they just landed into those situations. They weren't bored and just went out and sought an adventure. I think that's true of real life a lot of times. There are many times where there's things where I've gone through that have been incredibly difficult, where once I got to the other side of it, it changed me into a better person. And though it was quite difficult and I never quite asked to experience that adventure, Oftentimes, it's just what happened within life. It organically occurred that way, whatever challenge or difficulty that arose. However, just like he explained within the book, the reason why they had those stories to refer to and to learn about growing up is because those people didn't give up. They kept moving, they kept pushing forward. And so that way, their stories could help others. And so even if you or I might find ourselves landed into a situation or an adventure that we don't really want, at the end of the day, it's our responsibility to be resilient and to keep pushing forward. And it's my fervent belief that sometimes one of the reasons why we might be going through such difficulties is that it will put us in a position to where we will later be able to help out others who are going to experience something similar that is difficult. And we will be able to help them navigate that challenge so that way they will be more readily prepared and have the inspiration of our own stories so that way they can make it through the adventure that they've landed in. And another thought that I love within the book version of the speech is that he comes to the realization that their story is actually connected to the stories that they heard about long before. And he specifically cites the story of Beren and him acquiring or getting the Silmaril, and how Eärendil would come to possess that same Silmaril that Beren acquired from Morgoth, and that they in turn would be able to possess some of the light of that Silmaril that Eärendil acquired by them having that vial that was given to Frodo by Galadriel. And he was able to see that their story was somehow connected to the stories that they heard long before, the stories he was referring to, and the stories that I think would have provided motivation and inspiration for them to keep going. And I think that's true of life. Oftentimes we don't realize how interconnected all of our stories are. And that oftentimes we're all experiencing similar things, though we may not realize it or see it, because we're so entrenched within our own adventures that we've landed in and the difficulties that we're experiencing. However, if we're able to take a step back, we might be able to observe and to see that many others are experiencing what we've gone through, and that what we're experiencing is also things that our ancestors have experienced who came before us. And somehow we might find connection to their stories and how they were able to make it through, just like Sam and Frodo were able to find that connection. And just as a slight tangent what Sam was referring to is that Beren was a mortal man that wanted to marry literally the most beautiful elf that had ever lived, Luthien. Aragorn actually sings about Beren and Luthien within The Lord of the Rings, and Frodo asks him, who is he talking about? And that's where he talks about a man and an elf who fell in love. In order to be with Luthien, Luthien's father, who was a king, King Thingol, he demanded that Beren go to the first Dark Lord, Morgoth, and cut one of the Silmarils from the crown of Morgoth. He demanded something which he believed was impossible for Beren to do by going and stealing one of the Silmarils from the first Dark Lord, Morgoth, whom Sauron, the second Dark Lord, was initially a servant to. And the Silmarils were jewels that were coveted and sought after, that housed the light of two sacred trees that once provided light to the undying lands, that being Valinor. Despite that request seeming impossible, Beren and Luthien were able to accomplish this. Luthien was literally able to sing Morgoth to sleep with her enchanting voice. He fell asleep. Beren was able to cut the Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. There's way more that happened after that, but suffice it to say that he eventually was able to have the Silmaril, and he was eventually able to be with Luthien. And I'm going to make a video about that soon. And Beren and Luthien's granddaughter Elwing eventually came to have this Silmaril. And Elwing was married to Eärendil. And there were a group of elves who made an oath to have those Silmarils no matter what, because their ancestor Fëanor was the creator of those Silmarils. And those Silmarils were stolen by Morgoth. And during that time, Morgoth actually killed Fëanor's father, Finwë. And so out of revenge, Fëanor and his posterity made an oath that they would be the only ones to have those Silmarils. And once they found out that Elwing had one of those Silmarils, they attacked where Elwing was, and she thrust herself into the sea. She was then saved miraculously by a Valar named Ulmo. And a Valar is basically a spiritual angelic being that was made by the god of the Tolkien universe, that god being Eru Ilúvatar. And when that Valar saved Elwing, he turned her into a bird, and she flew to Eärendil with that Silmaril. Eärendil and Elwing then sailed to Valinor in order to plead for help from the Valar, those spiritual angelic beings that were created by Eru Ilúvatar, the god of the Tolkien universe, for them to help fight against Morgoth. And one of the consequences, or blessings if you will, from that is Eärendil was given that Silmaril, and he was able to wear it upon his head, and he was to sail the skies. and he would actually be the even star. And so in Middle Earth, whenever they were looking up into the skies and saw that star, the guiding star or the even star, that was actually Eorandil. Galadriel was able to capture that light within her pool of waters there in Lothlorien and put it into that vial. And she gave that vial to Frodo. And it's that vial that Frodo has during that time that Sam is giving that speech. And it's that connection that Sam is able to see how they're part of that same story, which is pretty incredible. One last thought, when Sam is describing or talking about their current situation, despite how difficult their situation is, he's able to see that Beron's situation was even more difficult, because Beron had to go literally in front of the first Dark Lord, someone who, from my understanding, is significantly more powerful than Sauron, that being Morgoth. And he literally had to go and to be in his presence within his kingdom, which would have been something even more dangerous and difficult to have to experience than what they were experiencing, despite what they were experiencing being very tough as well. I think that's an important thought sometimes, to realize that though we might be going through something really difficult in the adventure that we landed in, there are always those that are going through something that is incredibly more difficult. That's not to make us feel bad about how we are having a difficult time going through whatever it is that we're going through. However, sometimes that can put us in a place of gratitude. If we can take a look at our present situation, how difficult it may be, and be able to realize that there are those that have gone before us that were in worse situations and still made it through, and still were able to persevere, that we would eventually hear how amazing the ending of their stories were, that it might provide us motivation and put us in a place of gratitude, where we might realize that even though we're in this difficult situation, it's not as bad as those that have gone before us or those even around us currently. And again, it's not to put us in a place of feeling bad, but it's actually to put us in a place of feeling gratitude for the things that we do have despite the difficulties of our situation. And so it's this part, both within the book and within the film. They are vastly different as far as where they occur, and there are some differences as far as what the end result of the speech elicits. Sam's speech to Frodo elicits laughter, and for him to experience joy despite being in such a difficult circumstance. And within the film, Sam's speech provides needed motivation for Frodo to develop resiliency, for him to be able to face the next challenges of their adventure. But in the end, both provide the same thing, encouragement that Frodo needed in order for him to continue moving forward. I truly believe in what Sam states within the film, that there is some good in this world and it is worth fighting for. And so it's this part. I love it so much.